Great, thanks. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today, and again for our third and final panel discussion focused on FirstNet. In this discussion, we like to focus on what commercial carriers can offer to FirstNet. We've looked at the structure, at some of the partnership arrangements, and what FirstNet can offer to commercial carriers. Now we're going to turn it around a little bit and see what we can offer back as we move forward in some of these collaborative efforts to build out public safety broadband networks. I'm pleased to introduce another great panel for you today. So we have Christopher Yaw first, who serves as Director of Strategic Initiatives and National Public Safety Broadband Wireless Network Account Manager for Northrop Grumman. He has 26 years of experience in the technical computing space, with 10 years of experience designing, building, and maintaining broadband cellular networks globally. He served previously as Deputy Chief Engineer and Deputy Program Manager for the largest public safety wireless system in the United States, the New York City Wireless Network, taking that system from concept to its full operational state. Next, we have Joe Decken. He's the Director of Solutions Management for Transactional Network Services, TNS. Joe leads the pre-sales technical team responsible for development of new customer initiatives, managing key alliance relationships, and translating TNS product capabilities into solutions for mobile networks. Thank you. And next we have Greg Whitaker. He has more than 20 years of legal and public policy experience with a primary focus on regulatory, policy, and transactional issues relating to the wireless and wireline industry. And Mr. Whitaker counsels clients through complex regulatory and business issues, including interconnection and intercarrier compensation, E911, and CP&I information. And then last but certainly not least, we have Bob Ozzie, Sprint's Senior Vice President of Network. Mr. Ozzie directs the ownership and operations of the CDMA, IDEN, and global IP networks operated by Sprint. He leads a team of 2,000 employees who provide network development and deployment, access management, and service assurance for Sprint consumer and business customers. Mr. Ozzie has over 20 years at Sprint, and he has held senior leadership positions in network engineering, software development, network planning, and among other responsibilities. So if we could please welcome our panel and turn over to Christopher.
Well, everyone hear me? I suspect even if I didn't have the microphone, I could probably be heard by most of the room. I'm not exactly a quiet person. I've got to get my presidential stance here. Fields of fires. I'm good. So how many of you have actually heard of the New York City wireless system before? I've got 2 hands, 3, 4, maybe 5 hands in the room, 6 hands within the room. This is a model for what FirstNet ultimately is going to be. It was basically a stem of the events that happened in New York, from 9/11 to a ferry crash in the middle of basically the river, as well as a fire out in New Jersey, where interoperable communications, in fact all communications, stopped because of the fact of the public safety entities were using the commercial carrier systems. And they said, we can't have this. This is New York City. So they ultimately went around and built their own public-private. It was a cellular system built on CDMA technologies, which is owned and operated by the city of New York. There are no commercial people on it. But that will be different for FirstNet. So while the framework is there with ultimately all of the redundancy and the hardening, the reality is the user base needs to be expanded to ultimately the public service market. Now, New York did take advantage of that. In fact, some of the other comments on the last panel were, we need to expand this user base. When Sue spoke this morning about the 2 million public safety users, the reality is when we look at New York and we look at the ecosystem for what can actually be used on a FirstNet system, that ecosystem is much larger. And as an example, in New York, the largest user of that system is a public service entity. The Department of Transportation has embraced that network and deployed everything from basically GPS capabilities within their vehicles to every traffic light being managed within the actual city of New York on this wireless system. So in essence, they reduced a lot of their copper infrastructure and Verizon, AT&T infrastructure and replaced it with this system. And that has actually been a very, very large revenue generator for them. So in the case of FirstNet, they have to be looking at that, and you as consumers, or as me as carriers, you need to be looking at your user base and how can you actually leverage that as well. Also, one of the things that was brought up earlier in the case of Sue, she was saying, have any of you ever seen QoS operated on a cellular network? Well, I can say it does work because we implement QoS in New York, and that is simply something that has to be there. And in what I just described, we have a mix of public safety and public service users. The reality is that band between the public safety who need it first and foremost, they have a higher priority on the system. So we've been looking at this quite heavily for many, many years as far as how FirstNet is going to be involved or how it was basically evolved and what this network is going to be. And we as an entity and as a company, and we actually want to express to you as far as some things that you've probably already accomplished in your network are three, a little bit higher level entities. So, we're not down at the lower level E&OB environment. We're not at site deployments. But as far as it relates to identity management, cybersecurity, and application services, that really is our core competency and, our specialties. And one of those critical ones is identity management. Today within your networks, most of your identity management as far as logon and authentication is done by SIM or USIM. Well, when we get to FirstNet, that's going to be a different paradigm shift because no longer are we going to be authenticating the individual devices for access to the network. It has to be extended to the individual user as well. And so that's something that as you look to your system for advanced hosted services and how you may have implemented it by user-based as opposed to device-based, those are some of the entity capabilities that you may want to be able to bring to FirstNet and offer them saying, we've looked at that. We've looked at how identity management from a commercial perspective could be used to provide additional services. And by doing so, that's how FirstNet, you say, so why does FirstNet need that? More importantly is data access. Data access is critical within the FirstNet network. We're no longer dealing with commercial data. We're dealing with very, very sensitive data. Now, FirstNet by default, I don't believe has been mandated for secret level services, but at any point, you have HIPAA regulations for all your medical data. You have CJIS requirements for all of your FBI and criminal data. All that will be traversing the system, and you as operators, need to be cognizant that in those public-private partnerships that we've been talking about all day, that it isn't simply, hey, I've got a user, you're going to be riding on my system. I need to think a little bit deeper as far as how do I properly plan on authenticating those users? How do I ensure that in a shared user device environment, i.e. a mobile router and a police car, as Angie Siebel brought up earlier, how is that going to be used? Well, in most cases, that's used by 2 or 3 officers potentially in a period of a day. So how do I make that difference between the officer or a commander in this vehicle, and ultimately that gets shared over a day-to-day basis. So cybersecurity. How many people think this is going to be a critical asset? Yeah, in fact, this has been articulated as being a national critical infrastructure. So I can guarantee you there is a big, fat, red target on this system from a cybersecurity perspective. A lot of people, good and bad, are going to be looking at this system to see what can happen to it. So as you start building out your systems and some of the experiences you have from a cybersecurity perspective to protect both your eNode Bs, to protect your backhaul, to protect your EPCs, that has to be built into the system because, once again, national critical infrastructure and the data that will be made available to this particular system. Okay? And then application services. We had some earlier conversations actually at lunch on the deployment of IMS. These are application hosting environments, and they will be done potentially at a very, very localized level. So in essence, you will have national applications, which are made available by FirstNet, but then there will be localized applications, which can be offered by the actual competitive carriers themselves. What does a firefighter need? Those particular entities will come to you potentially as hosting partners and say, you know what, I really need this type of an application delivered to me on a regionalized basis. Not on the national level, as far as that would be offered by FirstNet themselves. So why do I talk about that particular infrastructure and how it applies here? Because the reality is that FirstNet is going to take a long time to build. We saw kind of a timeline of how that's going to be built, and we kind of see it as far as our perspective as being 3 major procurements, and the last one may have subcomponents to it, which is there has to be a PMO office. Somebody's going to have to manage it. And somebody said, how is a system, the last panel was, how are system integrators, involved in this? Well, here's a perfect example why system integrators, and myself being one, need to be involved. This is a federal contract. How many of you actually operate in the FAR world today? How many of you actually know what the FAR world is? Okay. That's what this system is going to be mandated by is FAR, and FAR in essence the government regulations and contract regulations. That's a critical part in understanding those particular components so that you can do proper billing, you can do proper invoicing, so you can do proper control managements and program managements. All that will be integrated into the system. All right. So from a national infrastructure, we kind of see first off the program management coming in. Secondly, we see, in essence, a national core being built out. So that national core, though, needs to be extensible and flexible enough to support you as hosted core members and with your public-private partnerships down at the state level being brought back in. So again, one of those systems integrator functions is to say, look, we're going to define a set of standards that ultimately everyone has to apply to, but there's always gray areas to that, and so ultimately, managing that. Right? So, the data piece that comes across this, we're talking about protect, publish, provide, and, publish and protect again, across different entities. So it's the 3 Ps. We have to protect that data stream. We have to basically publish application sharings, and then we have to provide the security around that to ensure that it works. And you guys have a very, very good dealing with that in many, many days. I mean, you've been operating you've been operating commercial services, for many, many years. And now how do we take those commercial services and the lessons learned and apply them to FirstNet? So, with that said, kind of the structure and architecture that we're looking at and the contracting models, I wanted to make one really clarifying point. We go to these FirstNet meetings and these public safety meetings constantly, and a very unique statement was made in this conference that we have never ever heard before, which really does open it up to the Competitive Carrier Alliance or Association, which is commercial users will be on the system as secondary users. I don't believe that's ever been articulated, formally in a public environment. So that is news. I mean, that really was something that was brought to light by multiple entities, and most importantly, Sue in their morning that secondary users could be commercial users. So, we know there's a couple of very, very large players out there which have 700 megahertz today. That really does open up the 700 megahertz window to the other carriers within the nation. Where they may not have had access to those licenses. So that was really critical. So the information assurance part, and just kind of getting back to that, this is different. I mean, as I stated earlier, the identity management has 2 different functions now. It has both the device authentication as well as the user authentication. The cybersecurity components, national critical infrastructure. And I wanted to take this in my final kind of statement as far as application environments, was that this will be operated slightly differently because of the fact of the sensitive data which will be going across the system. This isn't just simply let me go get a Samsung device and attach to this network. And beyond the fact of adding different transceivers within that device, there's a whole necessary requirement to harden those devices themselves. And your experience with your actual operators, with your vendors on those particular device ecosystems, because now we're dealing with sensitive data. And in the case of sensitive data, one critical thing is, basically securing data at rest. I can tell you, I could pull out my smartphone right now and I can see all the history, I can see everything I've ever downloaded. Well, that downloaded information can't, in essence, if I lose my device, be put into the hands of somebody else, because that's exactly what's going to happen for the public safety user as well. So that data ultimately needs to be secured. So with your ultimate security departments, I suspect there's ideas that you may have that you've thought about that you can incorporate back into FirstNet as well, saying, we've identified how we get secure this data. We do at the DoD level all the time, and that's something that we'll bring to the table. But the reality is you've probably gone through some of these trials and tribulations yourself. So the last piece I'm going to do to finalize my statements, I'll ask a couple of questions. So how many of you are actually within your commercial carrier networks today looking at next generation 911 services? Okay, I see a couple of hands going up. Is there a risk there? It's a completely different paradigm shift from what is happening on the public safety answering points today. The public safety answering points, which are in essence where I receive my 911 calls, are relatively closed systems. Now, that's completely changing with next generation 911 services. Now I'm going to be, in essence, sending out to my PSAPs, my public safety answering points, text, video, pictures. I can tell you, at least from our network, we don't allow JPEGs into our commercial network or into our private network from outside entities. Why? JPEGs can be embedded with code. JPEGs can be embedded with code which have, in essence, zero-day attacks or denial of service taxes built into them. So those are things you need to be cognizant of that in many cases, and let's take it to the perspective of the rural user, that they really haven't thought about it either. We speak all the time to these public safety entities, and say, for your PSAPs, for your public safety answering points, are you starting to think about what you need to put in place from an information assurance perspective for next generation 911. Everyone's saying, yes, we want next generation 911. We want to be able to service this market. But no one is thinking about the information assurance that goes along with that. Or very, very few people, I should say, are. even though they potentially are preparing from a bandwidth perspective, they're not thinking about how that ultimately needs to be secured. And I actually think that's a place where the Competitive Carriers Association can really take advantage of either A, putting in those hosted services to protect that data since it is traversing your network. I mean, this brings up all sorts of potential legislative and liability capabilities. So are you going to have to do this potentially anyways? Sure, but why not take the lead on that and say, you know what, we ultimately are going to protect the data we're sending those PSAPs for that next generation 911 services. Additionally, as you just start looking at your EPC deployments, how can I smartly deploy components of my EPC to, in essence, not bring some of that data back into my, let's say my standard core? Can I position my, PNS gateways at a place that ultimately sends that traffic directly to, in essence, these next generation 911 PSAP services? And I think you could bring a lot of intelligence, as far as what you've lived with previously to do that. So those are just some opening statements, some things to think about potentially as far as you could actually add value add to the ecosystem that isn't being really thought about in the public safety community, using, commercial services or your innovative ideas. And so thank you.
Hello, everybody. I appreciate your guys' time today. As I look out across the folks in the room, what stands out to me is a community of operators, service providers, application providers. The entire ecosystem literally sits here. And what I see is a great opportunity for synergy across the board and also general alignment of what you guys have already solved for in your commercial businesses. And I see a very unique proposition for us as we leave to consider, which is to take all of the years of experience and work that you have built and translate it into a very common fabric in this new world, in support of the FirstNet project, as well as in support of driving the revenue that each operator, whether you're at the city level, the state level or the regional level, there's networks that literally align to them. And so when you start to look at, how operators have evolved, right? They first started with, banding together and leveraging common assets and infrastructures and resources, and then they built, roaming relationships or bridges as they moved down that pipe, right? To where ultimately they were able to pay for some of their infrastructure through other people using it while they gained their own customers. So literally roam-only infrastructure, gain revenue, continue to invest in, in this case, a FirstNet infrastructure, and then kind of channeling that towards a model of where and when is the appropriate time to invest in the controls that are necessary to ensuring that at the time of an emergency that the bandwidth, the spectrum, the users can turn that traffic from being roaming or commercial use to, first responders use. And I believe that in, as we previously had been talking, a few general themes, around hosting of these applications, you can almost think of it as, the FirstNet project ends up looking like an MVNO to every one of these operators, whether it's the city, the state, the regional operator, as the mobile operators have already, created an infrastructure for things from, M2M mobile applications to mobile internet. And now it's literally specifying it towards each one of these layers of the market and providing commercial and charging principles for them to transition it. Right, and I guess what I'm saying as far as how do you transition into this model, I do believe that there is a hardening approach to how you go about it over time. And initially, it's about reach and capabilities, and so that first responders can move between local governments to state governments to help each other out, and that when they continue to move about the country, that they end up having charging principles that follow them, right? So that the people that are facilitating the service, can get paid for the service. And, state, local, regional operators interconnected with national players will, have already solved these problems, right? So I look, out at a lot of very familiar faces that, currently, leverage roaming solutions. In another room right down from here, right, we've got an ongoing roaming hub conversation about how we, kickstart all things 4G and LTE. And I think this becomes a natural extension of how you guys leverage your footprints and your assets and the momentum that you have going into these new investments that you're looking for, alignment around funding. So, backing up for a second, carriers, regional carriers, local carriers, right, have consistently proven a willingness to work together for switch sharing, packet data core sharing, bandwidth sharing, right? And then negotiating with, the larger operators, national operators, in a way that they can, trade out spectrum, to really align to make sure things work. And I think that a lot of those kinds of perspectives, roll into a much broader, bigger plan. But as long as we continue to align it back with how do I stand up this FirstNet network as a hosted MVNO, and then, implement devices and controls, whether it's, SIM cards or, things of nature where you can lock them down, provide some of the identity services, and then give the control to the public safety network because it's hosted, and in general, roaming goes back home. And so you have the opportunity to interject in controls, right? And those controls are, can be prioritized, they can have policies implemented against them, and ultimately, can have monetization opportunities over and above, very basic bandwidth consumption, whether they're key applications, M2M opportunities have been mentioned for traffic lights or, devices on police cars. And so then we get into a very basic question of how do we fund this thing? And I think that where you start is standing up and aligning, and I believe, almost every conversation at some point it seems we have is around what spectrum bands and where can we align to, and that's something that will follow right into here. But once you start to get beyond that, you can see a great opportunity to offer a mobile enterprise solution. So today, the public institutions, police departments, fire departments, on down the list at the state, at the city, local levels, right? They all have budgets for communication services. Why can't that budget shift to being a mobile broadband budget, and then that broadband fee gets to be reallocated based on that public service need, and that each state and city can work with their local operators as well as the national operators in setting those policies and priorities. But that literally becomes the enterprise opportunity for the carrier to solve those problems, at the same time generate revenue to foot the bill for what's beyond the initial funding plan here. So in wrap up here, this community has already come together on many fronts to form and to build and to evolve over the years around roaming, right? And it's the fundamental aspect of once somebody's got a device, that device becomes mobile, it's got to be able to go anywhere. And so us aligning to those strategies, and then where it makes the most sense at the infrastructure layer, building as much shared or common infrastructure as possible. Obviously diversity, geographically, locally, all those things have to be there to be a national asset. But over time, looking at ways to interject in value-added services that today are very commercial in nature and focused to consumers can also be extremely valuable to the first responders. And so we get to the point where we're saving thousands of lives and can really help to facilitate that what's next for how we evolve as as a community, not just a carrier enterprise. So That's all I've got for today. Thank you for your time.
Thanks. Greg?
Hi, everyone. I'm Greg Whitaker, and I'm with the law firm of Herman & Whitaker in the Washington, D.C. area. And I appreciate Tim and CCA for inviting me to speak today. I work with a lot of small and rural companies, or companies that serve rural areas. And so Tim asked me if I would come be on the panel and give the really rural perspective. So today I'm playing the role of the small carrier serving the rural area. And again, our focus here is, what can commercial carriers offer FirstNet? And so my role specifically is, what can small and rural carriers offer FirstNet? And I've been very heartened today to hear many of the speakers talk about just how important it is that FirstNet serve rural areas, okay? That's not obviously not always a given with services, and so it's nice to hear, and it's also required by the Act, so it's good to hear. I want to sort of give a little bit of perspective as well on the issue we're talking about here. So there are approximately 59 million people that live in rural counties. That's about 19% of the population, right, that live in rural counties. And we're talking about roughly 3.1 million square miles, or 86% of the geography. So, that's, my mind even has a hard time thinking about 3.1 million square miles and only 19% of the population. But it's critical that we serve that. And I think the people at this conference realize that there are more than 4 uniquely managed commercial networks, right? With all due respect to Sue Swenson, there are more than 4. Even the commercial network is a network of networks. And in order to serve, for FirstNet to serve and be ubiquitous, or sort of ubiquitous, or even a little bit ubiquitous, FirstNet, I think, is going to have to leverage and include that network of carriers. So what can we bring to the table, particularly in rural areas, given the limited amount of funding that goes with that? The access, the towers, power, backup power, which is so critical, all right? I mean, these are hard dollars for FirstNet, and carriers already have that in the ground. So it's a big piece. The backhaul piece itself, right, is going to be huge and expensive. In many states, though, there are already statewide networks of fiber that connect cell sites. So there's already opportunities, there's already facilities and assets that can certainly be leveraged. But in addition to sort of some of those hard assets, what do rural carriers have? Well, they also have local relationship and expertise. We've heard a lot about whether how the governance will be and the involvement of states. And rural carriers, we're already there, or they're already there, okay? For instance, I can't speak for every rural carrier, but I represent a lot, and public safety entities are already on our towers. They're already on our towers. They're there. Our employees are already members of the volunteer fire department. We're there. I talked to a company this morning. We're already providing broadband wireless data cards to 3 different law enforcement agencies in our area. Okay, so that's 3G right now. In a couple of months, that's going to be LTE. Now, it's true, you probably can't back a fire truck over the device. It's probably not going to work if that happens, but those are things that can be worked out. But is it really going to make sense to take that device away and just to use a FirstNet device? Or is it going to make sense to have a partnership that merges those and makes the hardening where necessary, and perhaps in rural areas, it's going to be different. What else? Obviously, roaming. Look, I think you all understand that even with the large carriers, coverage is not ubiquitous. They achieve ubiquitous coverage through roaming relationships. I think that in part that's going to be Siebel. For carrier. Eyes.
Perspective and we take communication. Understanding pass all behind number of players, but all involvement in, I was privileged to be on the Interoperability Board that was commissioned a year ago to really look at how do you create a network that is truly interoperable. And that was a very enriching experience for me personally and for the team that I had helped support me to really continue to explore what are the requirements, what are the emerging requirements and such. So out of that, I think that, you know, there's a lot of things that we as a national commercial carrier can offer to FirstNet. And there's a lot of different ways we would like to be interested in exploring to see where does it fit. First and foremost, we understand that to get to a reasonably economical and timely deployment of the capabilities, we do have to find ways to use existing assets, existing towers, backhaul, RAN network, spectrum that's already enabled for LTE. And there is, fortunately, from the technology front, a lot of ways to enable that in the LTE space that were far more difficult to enable in the GSM, CDMA, 3G space. So we can certainly take advantage of that. If you look at the way you can approach the interest of services, at the end of the day, it's the service provided, but within that are the applications that are enabled on the network, the devices that use that, and then the network itself. And across all those fronts, there's different types of partnerships that we can bring to bear with our expertise, because at the end of the day, FirstNet is really a national nonprofit public agency, but it's a carrier. And so it will be confronted with the same types of interests, challenges, and solutions that a typical carrier has to become involved with. We can partner with FirstNet to help find the ecosystems that will be supportive to develop the chipsets and the devices and the modules that will be required to go into fire trucks and police cruisers and the like. How the applications work in a reliable, consistent fashion. How do you distribute those applications? How do you provide the security in those applications and in the network? These are all the types of problems that a carrier like us are out there solving today for our customer base. And certainly at the, it takes it up a notch because of the more stringent and urgent requirements that the public responding, the first responder universe really has to address. So there are a number of different ways we've looked at and are willing to consider and want to consider. I think I counted 7 different variations on network sharing that you can do, RAN sharing. A number of these we've been testing and deploying the technology to help enable it. And part of that is because of our somewhat unique relationship with Clearwire, and we're really testing how call it a third-party RAN network can become part of another network. So in our case, our core network will be integrated and interoperate with a Clearwire-owned and operated network up until hopefully the point that transaction concludes in some way. But the point is, though, that we know how this technology works. It isn't something that FirstNet can be passive about, and it's something that carriers are not passive about. And what I mean by that is there are standards out there that can be deployed, but a carrier has to go enable them to make them happen in the real world by working actively with the standards communities, with the device manufacturers, with the equipment manufacturers to make it happen. And I do believe that the requirements that will emerge for public safety, they will be wanting to use standards that are out there but may not be actually commercially available via the ecosystems, whether the network ecosystem or the device ecosystem. And so ways that we can partner with FirstNet to make that happen on a global basis so that they actually do materialize in real products that are available for purchase for the end user or for the network operators along the way. So I think in summary, to be frank, it's still a little bit of a moving target in terms of what are the partnerships that will work. From our perspective, everything's on the table. We're willing to look at and explore every idea that's out there. We have a lot of our own that we think will be relevant. Certainly, and quite honestly, it has to make business sense for us. But on the other hand, we know the importance and the national policy it is to the country, and that's why we're very much engaged and have resources that are already dedicated to explore all these options and see what's available. There's certainly the need to how do you fund this thing, and so we can play a role in roaming onto the FirstNet 700 spectrum. That's something that we're looking at to see how that would be feasible, and conversely how FirstNet customers could roam onto our network in order to supplement the coverage and capacity that eventually starts to materialize around the 700D block. So, at this point, do we have a clear idea of here are the 4 business models that work for us? No, but we've got a lot of ideas that we have been sharing with the FirstNet staff over the last couple of months, ranging from things that can be done right now, products and services that could be certified as being public safety quality, how that could really move into sort of an MVNO arrangement. We have a lot of experience with MVNO arrangements, and how might you have a FirstNet branded phone that operates effectively on the Sprint network, but it has the backing, the consideration, the certification, the requirements that are defined for the public safety community by FirstNet, and moving all the way through the various versions of RAN sharing, network sharing that are possible in this environment. So we really look forward to how this evolves, and we've been wanting to engage and stay engaged in all the conversations so we can find what role we have and really be able to add our assets to the pile of assets that can really serve a very important need. So thank you very much, and I guess we'll go back to the moderator. Great.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone. So to kick off with a couple questions, we've heard throughout the day that building out the FirstNet network will take time. It took 10 years after the 9/11 Commission for FirstNet to even become a thing and exist through the legislation. It's going to take even longer to continue to build out the network. We've heard a lot in this panel about the role of roaming, and I wanted to ask our panel to start off with how can some of these roaming relationships help provide public safety with LTE and mobile data network access immediately, and how can it help fill in gaps as the FirstNet network itself is being built out? And so anyone that would like to take it?
First.
I guess we have to drag this over a bit. Well, I mean, it is fairly straightforward. It is sort of the obvious first step that you have available LT networks. They're commercially available. They actually work really well, and they are very reliable. They do come under stress in times of emergency, and can. And they can, so that capability can easily be coupled through very straightforward commercial arrangements with FirstNet, and be integrated in the device set that FirstNet or the public safety agencies are really looking to purchase. It certainly has to kind of center around the devices and what is that model? Is it something that the first responders buy directly from a carrier like ourselves, or is it something that FirstNet more directly gets engaged with? Like I said, maybe a certified package to start with, moving to an MVNO arrangement later on. Those may be very logical ways that can, take ready access for that for most circumstances. The more I would imagine from the most routine of responsiveness to the traffic accident or the burglary and such, the quality of the network is where it really is going to matter, and it's going to work, and it's going to work just fine. So it's a good way to get started. It's a good way to provide a value add through that process.
To kind of give you the real world example of how that is actually working in other networks, and specifically in New York City, roaming in some respects is a consolidated bill. So I can get one bill that has both entities if wherever I went onto a single bill. So while they haven't necessarily been able to implement that because there is no billing with FirstNet, it's a city-owned asset, it becomes a device which is dual-homed. I mean, it's as simple as that, because when we look at FirstNet, it isn't necessarily just the last mile services. It isn't necessarily just, the ability for my cell phone device to talk to a tower. It's the full application suite which is behind it. One of those requirements, and it's actually written in legislation, or at least we've seen it, I should say it isn't written in the legislation, but they're saying this is critical, is geospatial applications. So in essence, every device on FirstNet will have to have a GPS receiver, and ultimately be able to broadcast that information back into a central command and control station. And in the case of New York, obviously, a perfect example is the Department of Transportation goes into New Jersey. And in New Jersey, there is no coverage for NiceWin, but there is AT&T, Verizon, Sprint coverage. So we have dual home devices, and the application suite becomes agnostic to the last mile services. So the roaming is ultimately operating correctly. It just simply happens to be two bills in those particular occasions. And what we're doing is homogenizing that into a single bill.
Yeah, I mean, as Bob suggests as well, it's a device issue. Is key, and I'm going to go back to my interoperability soapbox, because we've got to obviously have multi-band devices, and so that's something that we're going to have to overcome some of the hurdles of the current islands of bands that we have, and to make that cost effective for FirstNet to deploy a band 14, a band 17, or band 12, or band 13 devices as well is going to be interesting and critical if we're going to actually solve the roaming piece and be able to do that anytime soon.
Well, Greg,
you throw some other bands as well there.
Well, I think you're right. I think the number of bands that the LT is developing and the growing number of bands really certainly is an issue. And I'll join you on that soapbox where collapsing 17 and 12 reduces some of that complexity as public safety looks at potential partnerships. Joe, you mentioned hubbing in your remarks. What do you think that hubbing can offer FirstNet as they look out, and how can that help provide access to several smaller carriers at once rather than having to reach individual roaming deals?
I think initially it comes back to funding and finding, how does everybody get started? With already, constraints around transition from some operators are taking the hop from 2G to 4G, and this is an all 4G network. There is significant funding requirements there, and so I believe that a hub and at hosted solutions, whether it's a hosted Evolved Packet Core or a hosted IMS network, helps to leverage the existing assets. So things like towers and power and radio network can be leveraged but tied into hosted hub infrastructures. So you get kind of an immediate economies of scale. And then as you go over time, right, and capacities grow, you move from more of a shared infrastructure to a dedicated infrastructure as, bills get paid and operators make money. I think that's the immediate role, is to set up the commercial framework and fabric, and then to show the general charging principles that, you guys have spent many decades building.
Great, thanks. We heard earlier in the day how it's critically important in this project that now we have public safety communications and commercial communications working off the same LTE technology as we're looking forward. I wanted to ask the panel here, how can partnerships with commercial carriers help keep that parallel up to date? How can we keep public safety on the right upgrade path and make sure that as technology continues to evolve, that we are able to continue to leverage joint investments in this space?
I'll start real quick, and I actually, that will be a challenge. In the commercial space, obviously, you guys have, Moore's Law is 18 months. We're basically migrating through technologies and doing upgrades every 18 months. And yet the procurement cycles in essence, within the government, don't follow that model. I don't have my users going out and getting new devices every 18 months, as was talked about earlier. So that will be a challenge. Most of it, or a lot of it's going to have to be done in software. So what can be done in software, ultimately, that and they don't, will be done so. So additional releases going from, say, release 8 to release 9. We know that that's done in software. Will release 10 or 11 have that same requirement to be only in software? Will it require a different ASIC? Have no idea, but that becomes part of that operating model for a self-funding model, and hence why they can't necessarily rely just on the public safety users. They have to have a user base will allow them to generate revenue to then perform those updates.
Yeah, I think I agree it's challenging. I think FirstNet does have an opportunity to create the consolidated voice for the requirements of the public safety agencies across the country, because operating on their own, New York's a bit of a very unique area in that, because of the requirements, because of 9/11, because of just it's New York, they have the requirements, the resources, the wherewithal to do things like a 2.5 network and those sorts of things on their own. But I think the vast majority of municipalities and states and such don't quite have that kind of expertise or resources that they can really provide to it. So FirstNet can provide that help, and I think it's important for FirstNet to do so that there is that voice at the table, not only in the standards bodies, but also with the manufacturing of the devices, the standards, the releases, what really materializes in products that can be offered economically and in a timely fashion. Without that voice, then things will proceed on their national course, and it'll take potentially longer to get the real things that the first responders really need. And if it is fragmented across thousands of requirements and municipalities, I don't see how that is going to be very effective to really get what first responders really need.
Yeah, I think it's going to be critical, obviously, that FirstNet follows, open standards, as opposed to black box unique designs. And I think that's going to be critical, and I think that's going to help. I think that's been part of the problem, is the more unique design specific, system specific obviously takes longer. And so the more that FirstNet can follow the commercial model of open standards, I think we'll be able to see faster integration and faster innovation.
I think that there's an interesting component here, and Bob touched on a little bit around the MVNO plan, which if you look at devices and standardization and literally branding around FirstNet, you get the opportunity to see how a model can start at the national level and transcend to each of the other regions, whether it's the state or the local level, and by aligning on things as band 12 or band 17 and roaming models that the operators, the national operators, will help maintain and evolve the public safety network inherently by keeping the devices and the radios and each operator in that ecosystem down to the rural market will be buying and supporting the same type of technology. So I think by looking at FirstNet as a standalone operator that's going to, switch between multiple operators and roaming, that ecosystem has been established, right? So you would follow similar processes.
Great, thanks. So we're down to our last few minutes. I wanted to open it up to the room and see if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask of our panel. And if not, I've got a few more, so we're not done yet. Well, I would like to ask the panel. I know, Greg, you brought up several of the aspects that commercial carriers offer to public safety today and can offer going forward, from including backhaul and 3G service and tower access and rights of way and on and on and on. To the whole panel, what steps can carriers take to provide one-stop shopping for FirstNet as they're looking at potential partners?
That's a great question.
Yeah. I mean, the one-stop shopping arguably revolves in many aspects around devices. And so whether that within your retail environments, over in the left-hand corner, you have devices which are multi-purpose for both public safety as well as for public service. Say is a great concept. However, the reality is that fall within the procurement model of the government. I mean, typically in many aspects, I'm not going to have my firefighter go into a Sprint store and say, buy this device, just bill my government. Maybe that is a model that we can establish as carriers, where in essence we work with the municipalities to establish those purchasing agreements so that they can do that on some type of an upgrade cycle. So I think that's going to be challenging at the device level. But at the other side, from one-stop shop, it's taking into account some of these requirements that are part of the public safety community. And as I stated earlier, we're not talking about necessarily just the last mile services. Said repeatedly throughout the day is preemptive and priority access. As you start building out your 4G networks, or as you start expanding your capacity into IP-based services, can we do a little thinking ahead and establishing those quality of service metrics on my backhaul or throughout my core network at the different distribution layers, and saying, what, I can offer these services as a one-stop shop and ensure that you have that priority. But at the device level, I think it really is going to depend upon the government procurement model, for the individual municipality.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's going to be any such thing as one-stop shopping, much as I would like for there to be with this. I think it's critical right now that people are engaging in the states and with public safety so that we have the right expectations, and so that when the models come out, that they are meetable by both public safety and by commercial carriers. I would love to be able to say, one-stop shopping, but I think the needs of the states are going to be different. And again, just because there's a FirstNet network deployed doesn't mean that anybody in a particular locality is going to use it. So they may yet use a commercial or a dedicated system. So that's going to be a challenge, possibly by locality basis.
Thanks. Any other questions in the room? Chuck.
I might be hearing things differently, but it seems to me like we've got a disconnect between FirstNet folks' idea of a network and our idea of the network. It seems to me like our idea of the network is them coming in purchasing from us. It seems to me like their idea of the network is that they may purchase something wholesale from us, but establishing their own independent network. Is that right, or am I just hearing things differently?
Well, from the legislative perspective, it is they're building, they will be an operator. They will build an EPC, they will build backhaul, they will build RAN. In many cases, it'll be exclusively owned by FirstNet. In other cases, they'll have wholesale MVNO agreements with commercial carriers. But I don't, at least in my personal opinion, and I don't believe this will be an entire MVNO network. I believe there will be government-owned assets And then that government-owned asset will be augmented by the commercial carriers.
Great. Well, with that, we'll end on that unless there's any final remarks from our panel. Well, I wanted to thank everyone for the attention. I think that today serves as a great beginning and step along this. I think there'll be many further aspects of this discussion to come and encourage continued engagement on this issue. I think we've really touched on an important issue going forward and will remain deeply engaged on it. So thank you. Thanks to our panel. Thank you all. Thank you.
If we can help with any of this